What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to The Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insights. My name is Reese, a very warm welcome to you, and in today's video, we're going to take a quick look at a new visual element in the dashboard, which is trying to quantify how consistent each driver has been across the season. And then we'll spend a minute or two talking about how to identify where that sweet spot between chasing big points and scoring consistent points is for you and your leagues. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company Play On that sponsors the game. If it's not already obvious to you from my spreadsheet, I am a bit of a data nerd and I love Formula One. Formula One is my passion. So I figured, why not try and build a community of other like-minded people here on YouTube? If that sounds good to you, stay tuned to the channel for all sorts of awesome fantasy content. And now we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, so as I said at the top of the video, today we're going to compare the drivers' consistency across the season. What we have here on screen is the Fantasy Drivers' Championship, but instead of the weekly scores or the line graph showing the running total of the top 10, we have each driver's minimum and maximum score from each race of the season, excluding actual DNFs and any race where the driver was awarded 0 or less fantasy points. Above each of the point spreads is a percentage, and you can think of that as a kind of confidence rating. So that's essentially how sure we are that any given driver will land within their point spread on any given weekend. Lastly, the yellow diamonds are the driver's season-long averages, so that's every result including DNFs and races where the driver was awarded 0 or less fantasy points. That way, you can see how a driver's average compares to their spreads with one chart. What I want to do now is run through all 20 drivers at a very high level, and then I'll talk you through how you can use this data to compare one potential lineup versus another going into any given race weekend. As is the trend this year, we'll start with Max. Max is the highest scoring driver so far this season by a margin of 2 points. Max's max is 62 points and he clocked that at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. Max did of course retire from 2 of the first 3 races, but once you exclude those values, Max's lowest score this season is 16 points, which came from the race at Silverstone where he had issues with his DRS. What this view tells you is that 88% of the time, Max is going to score you between 16 and 62 points. And on average, he's going to score you 41.3 points. So if you include him in your team, you can rest easy knowing that in almost 9 out of 10 races, you're going to be scoring a good haul of points. Up next is George, who has now scored between 26 and 53 points in 94% of the races so far this season, making him the highest scoring of the equally most consistent drivers. The one race where George missed out on the Magic 26 was his home race at Silverstone, where he clocked his first and only DNF as a Mercedes driver. Sadly for George, it's a case of always a bridesmaid, never a bride, because while George has been super consistent this season, he's just not quite managed to step up onto the top step of the podium. He did finish 1 point behind Max at Zandvoort, so maybe we can just give it to him in spirit. Something that really caught my eye here is seeing George and Charles side by side like this, because these two have been locked in a pretty intense battle for P2 in the fantasy standings ever since Charles slipped off the top spot after Monaco. As I said in my post-race report of the Belgian Grand Prix, George made the move and overtook Charles in the championship, and since then he has gone on to build and now maintain a healthy 24-point margin over Charles. Comparing their bars, you can see that all season George has been playing the long game, and after 16 races, the long game is now winning. Yes, Charles's maximum score is 7 points higher than George's, but after 16 races where George is scoring at least 26 points in 94% of the races, and Charles is only scoring at least 14 points in 81% of the races, George's consistency has now finally enabled him to overtake Charles in the fantasy standings. As I just said, George currently has a 24-point lead over Charles, which feels to me like a real mental barrier because that gap, those 24 points, are basically George's weekly minimum score. So if Charles is going to overtake George in the standings and reclaim P2, not only will he need to switch it on, but he will need George to switch off. And based on George's confidence rating, it's not looking likely. Talking about Charles, Charles is up next, and Charles's range is exactly the same as Max's, but his minimum and maximum scores are 2 points lower. The big difference between Max and Charles is the confidence rating. Max is at 88%, but Charles is only at 81%. So that's a 7% difference between the two drivers. But with Charles, what you lose in confidence, you make back in budget. Yes, Charles is 7% less consistent than Max, but Max is 62% more expensive than Charles. So the question you need to answer for your teams is, Does Max's consistency justify the additional expense? If you want to make this even harder on yourself, you can bring George into the mix because George is the filling in this little sandwich. So the real question is Max, George, or Charles? Big points, consistent points, or cost-effective points? It's a good question to spend some time on. Sergio is next, and what's interesting here is comparing Sergio to his next door but one neighbour, Carlos. If you took this view away and just asked me to bet on who the more consistent driver was across the season, I think I would have backed Carlos just because Sergio's recent form has been lackluster at best, and recency bias is a thing. But not only is Sergio still more consistent across the season, his point spread is 31% tighter than Carlos's. So for two drivers who are so comparable price-wise, this data really suggests that if you have to pick between Sergio and Carlos, you should back the bull over the horse. On to Lewis now, and Lewis is a great pick in terms of consistency. 94% is the highest rating amongst the drivers after Lance's DNF at Monza. So yes, Lewis is one of only 5 drivers with a rating of 94%. But the problem with Lewis this season is he's the most expensive driver. And sadly, he's in the bottom 6 of the points per pound rankings. Whereas Max, who is comparable in terms of price, is in the top 4. So while 94% is great, you'd be mad to pick Lewis when you can pick Max, which would only marginally increase your risk, but massively increase your reward. Next up is Carlos, and again, take this view away, I would have said that across the season, Carlos and Charles's results have been very comparable. And in a way they are, because Charles is 6% more consistent, but Carlos is 8% cheaper. But Charles's higher score is higher, and Carlos's lower score is lower, which tells us that Charles is the clear pick if you have to pick between them. Carlos is also the least consistent driver in the top 6, and his average is 2 points lower than his nearest rival in the standings. So as much as it pains me to say it, I think this view is pretty damning evidence against picking Carlos. Lando is very interesting. He is the best of the rest, no doubt, and he has been very consistent this year, also scoring 94%. So he's the third of the 5 drivers on 94%, but his spread is huge, and Lando has scored a very sad single point on more than one occasion this year. So given the fact that his price tag is on the higher end, I'd say yes, he is low risk, but it's medium reward, which probably doesn't justify his price tag. Comparing the Alpine drivers is always fun, and it's nice that there's side by side like this because it makes it really easy for us. So you've decided you want some Alpine in your team. How do you decide between these two? 33 versus 32 on the range. Fernando technically the bigger risk of the two because Esteban is the 4th of our 5 drivers on 94%. And Fernando coming in on the low end with a 75%. Across the season, Fernando has put in the higher high, and he has the higher low, which makes his spread more attractive, but Esteban has the edge on the weekly average, and his consistency puts him in another league compared to Fernando. For me, going into the final 6 races of the season, it could go either way. Monza was not kind to Alpine, with Fernando being dealt the worst of the 2 hands, and I'd say this is a great example of where the data can only take you so far. Ultimately, this is where you have to step in and make a decision. There are 6 races left this year. Pick Fernando, pick Esteban, swap them in and out week to week, it doesn't matter. Just make sure you have one of them because both of these drivers are capable of bringing the points home when you need them, and they are both very affordable options. Up next is Seb, and to be honest with you, Seb is kind of middle of the road on all fronts. He is very affordable, his points are better than some, worse than others, and his consistency is pretty good at 81%, so Seb is a good pick. He's not a great pick, but he's certainly not a bad pick. I think it's fair to say that Seb has firmly planted his car in the middle of the track, trying to defend his position and hold on to P10 in the championship. In terms of comparisons, I don't think it's valuable to compare Seb to either of the Alpine drivers. Obviously, we can easily compare Seb to Lance, and we will, but I just want to draw your attention over here. Seb and Pierre's season-long performances are almost identical. Both drivers are on 81%, both spreads are set at 21 points, and their highs and lows are both within 1 point of each other. They are so close to each other, and yet Pierre is 1.2 million more expensive. This might sound like an odd take, but if you have Pierre in your team, or you decide you want to add Pierre into your team, I would suggest pivoting away from AlphaTauri and looking towards Aston Martin, because swapping Pierre for Seb will claw back 1.2 million of budget that you can use to promote a backmarker. And Seb is beating Pierre in 62% of the races anyway. So almost the opposite of the Alpine situation. This is one decision where the data is really clearly suggesting an action. Looking at Lance, who is a diamond in the rough here in the middle of the rankings. Mostly flying under the radar this year, Lance has been super consistent, scoring between 8 and 16 points all season long. And if he had managed to finish where he was when he pulled into the pits to retire at Monza, he would have been on for the same spread, but his consistency would have been 100%, because going into Monza, Lance was the only driver not to have DNF'd a single race this season. As we all saw, Monza was not kind to Aston Martin this year, and both Seb and Lance retired from the race. So that means the king of consistency now becomes the fifth of the 5 drivers on 94%. Lance is not necessarily piling up the points this year, but you have to admire his consistency, and that's essentially what you're paying for. Slightly more expensive than, say, Alex, Kevin or Mick, and yes, less maximum points than all 3 of those drivers, but it's that slightly elevated minimum score that you're paying for with Lance, because so far Lance has scored at least 8 points in 94% of races. So for 9.1 million, those points represent some great value. Now, should you pick Lance or should you pick his teammate Seb in hopes of getting a slightly higher high score? You can. The data tells us that over the course of the season, things have essentially balanced out between these two because their averages are currently within 0.5 points of each other. So for me, I think if you want some Aston Martin in your lineup, put the extra 2.7 million that Seb costs towards upgrading other drivers and add the Maple Man into your team. Up next we have Valtteri, and I've been kind of harsh about Valtteri's performance in recent weeks, but at the same time I'd say I've been fair because Valtteri has currently scored -6 points across the last 7 races. Now that's not necessarily captured here, but look at that spread. 31 points looks kind of out of place down here, and this is the first time we're seeing 69% on the board, so Valtteri setting a new low for the confidence ratings. Valtteri's season really has been a tale of two halves. If this was Canada, Valtteri would be near the top, because going into Silverstone, Valtteri was in P7, and now, 7 races later, he's down in P13. I had Valtteri in my team this year. In all honesty, I stuck with him a long time after the data suggested pivoting away, but going into the last 6 races, Valtteri is not a driver you should be considering, because his point spread is too wide, and his confidence rating is too low for a driver that costs 9.5 million. Alex is next, and something I want to point out here is that if the drivers were ordered based on their max score, Latifi would be rock bottom of this ranking. So comparing the Williams drivers, we can see that Alex is the clear pick. He is more consistent. When he scores big, he scores bigger. When he scores low, he scores higher. Yes, it's only by 1 point, but in the 25% of races where Latifi falls outside his spread, he would have robbed your team of 25 points. Whereas in the 12% of races where Alex falls outside his spread, he would have only robbed you of 16 points. For me, this view really solidifies it. There is no compelling reason to ever pick Latifi over Albon. What I want to do ahead of my next team selection video is create a little diagram that attempts to condense the pool of drivers down from 20 to 14-ish who are still viable picks at this point in the season. So then we can say with a high degree of certainty, these 6-ish drivers should not even be factored into your considerations. Technically, Yuki will be the first driver going into that pool, but Latifi will be the second. And so if you want Williams in your team, pick Albon every single time. Moving on to look at the Haas drivers, next we have Kevin and Mick. And look, these two are week in, week out wrestling for the top spot in the teammate deltas. Kevin currently has the edge over Mick, his margin is just 1 single point. And this chart really does evidence just how consistent these two drivers are. Their spread is the same, 25 points. Kevin has a 1 point jump on Mick, which is essentially nothing. They're both scoring within their range in 69% of the races. Honestly, I don't think there has ever been a pair of drivers more evenly matched from a fantasy point of view. What I will say is this, based on the 69%, both Kevin and Mick are due at least a 1 more DNF or negative score between now and the end of the season. So, if you get that call right and drop the driver the week they drop the bag, you'll lock in big stacks of points for 6.1 and 6.3 million. If Haas gets hit with a tragic double DNF one week, then at least you know there was no right decision that week. Before we move on, if you're thinking, hang on, why is it okay for Mick and Kevin to have a 69% rating but not Valtteri? Kevin and Mick are 3 million schmeckles cheaper than Valtteri. You just don't have the same expectations of the backmarkers as you do of a driver that should be fighting for best of the rest. That being said, I do just want to add that over the course of the season, both Mick and Kevin have proven they're not just cheap picks. They are both better options than 4 other drivers who are all more expensive. So don't be sleeping on the Haas boys. They are both really good picks. Daniel will be the third driver added to our recently established pool of hard passes. There is not really anything else to say. Latifi we've covered. Guan Yu Zhou, in my opinion, marginally better than Latifi because of the higher high, but he's 1.2 million more expensive, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure what the 1.2 million would buy you. I was very happy to see that Guan Yu Zhou has re-signed with Alpha for 2023. I'm not sure what the publicly available details of his deals say, but I'm personally very happy to see that he will be on the grid again next year. I think he's had a fantastic rookie season in real life, and there's a lot of positives for the Chinese driver. But from a fantasy perspective, for the rest of this year, I think let's watch and hope to see some improvement, but let's not invest. Last but not least, we have Yuki, and Yuki is actually the least consistent driver by far this year. In 50% of the races, Yuki will score you between 3 and 30 points, and in the other 50%, his average is a -5 per race. So, yeah. Currently bottom of the pile in terms of points scored and rock bottom in terms of consistency. This data confirms that Yuki should not be a part of anyone's teams at the moment. I was actually very surprised to see that AlphaTauri offered him another year. I was half expecting to see Helmut Marko promote one of Red Bull's F2 roster to the Red Bull sister team, but I'm happy for Yuki. I think he has a lot more to offer, and hopefully next year's car will enable him to showcase the best of himself. For the next 6 races, I wouldn't put Yuki in my team if you said I could have him for free and he would count as a 6th driver, because it's 50-50 on if he will score 3 or steal 5. Okay, so pausing here on the drivers and kind of thinking about how you can use this for your teams. Each week, I use the drivers' average scores to create a target in my mind, and I compare the average scores of a few lineups to pick my final team. Averages are great, especially this late in the season, but what I would advocate for you to do is still use the average data from the Fantasy Championship, but also use these ranges to map out best case and worst case scenarios. Let's use Monza as an example. My lineup was Max, George, Leclerc, Alonso, Stroll, and Haas. The season-long averages suggested I would score 41 for Max, 30 for George, 28 for Leclerc, 13 for Fernando, and 10 for Lance. So that's 122 from my drivers. Now, as it happens, I ended up scoring 45 for Max, 35 for George, 33 for Charles, -4 for Fernando, and -9 for Lance. So that's only 100 points, 22 points less than what I was targeting. It doesn't help soften the blow when you get hit with double losses, but if I had looked at the team and said, okay, my minimum score should be 69 points, the maximum score would be somewhere north of 220, am I happy with the consistency of my drivers, or do I think I'm carrying too much risk? Perhaps I would have decided to take Fernando out and put Esteban in based on the confidence ratings. Would I rather go for more points but carry more risk, or reduce the risk and increase the confidence? This part is not science, none of this is science. I think a lot of the time our opinions of drivers and teams can really cloud our judgment. And what this view does for me, and hopefully does for you, is remind me that if I want a certain outcome to happen in the race because I love driver A or hate driver B, and that outcome has a less than 6% chance of happening, then I'm really setting myself up for disappointment come lights out. I hope this has been useful for you. I've really enjoyed pulling this view together, and I'll try and keep on top of it for future videos. I think seeing the range your lineup can achieve and quantifying that range with some confidence levels is useful when comparing potential lineups for a weekend. As I said, I hope you enjoyed this one. It's my first upload that's not a race report or a team selection, so I'll be interested to see how this does compared to those videos. I'm also putting this out on a Thursday because that works better for my schedule, so hopefully that works for you because, as I said at the top, I love Formula One, the sport is my passion, and it's just fun to try and give something back to the fantasy community. Stay tuned for my team selection for Singapore coming on Saturday. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to look at this with me. Hope you have a great day ahead, and I'll see you again very soon.